You may have listened to a review, maybe one that I've done, and I'll talk about the combat feeling weighty, or the UI feeling like it has a lot of weight, or the story feeling like it has a lot of weight. And video games in general have a weight to them. They have a feeling because it is something you interact with. And while things that aren't interactive can have a feeling of weight as well, I'm mostly talking about video games here. Michael here, welcoming you to Design View. And today, we're going to be talking about game weight and why it's important. Or rather, its importance. I don't know how I'm going to title these videos. I don't do that right off the bat. But anyways, I want to talk about game weight because I talk about it a lot in my reviews, and I talk about it a lot in video game discussion because it's something that game designers and critics really kind of talk about a lot. And it's a little bit different for everyone depending on what they actually think this is. But the game weight is essentially talking about how heavy something feels, or even heavier, as in I add in another color. When you end up looking at like an image, for example, if you look at the circle, you'll be like, oh, well, that side of the circle feels heavier because it's more filled out or has more color in it, etc., etc. And that's kind of like what we're feeling. And it's a feeling, 100%. It is something that we feel as people, and therefore it doesn't really have a definition per se, but it means a lot of things. And there's a lot of different things that can have weight, such as combat. So you end up having combat, maybe movement, or you can have, I'm just doing terrible here, maybe the UI, for example. The UI can feel very heavy or really descriptive, or the story. And I'm going to kind of talk about all of these in a little bit of a nutshell. Now for combat's the really, really easy one. This is when you end up going into a combat situation. Let's say, you have an enemy over here and his name is Davis for whatever reason. And then he's Davis. Yay, Davis. And then you have you with your little sniper rifle here or whatever. I don't know. I don't know why I always go to guns for these types of descriptions, but that's what I've got. And your name is Carl. I don't know. Just to cart. There we go, Cart. Your name is Cart. And then so basically, the weight would be when you end up firing this rifle, it has a kickback. Or let's say you end up using a sword. And so when the sword ends up hitting Davis, and Davis is like, oh no, I'm dying or whatever, he's like, he's got his hands up. When the sword actually strikes him, then the screen shakes, or it has a little bit of a kickback. And the importance to this is the fact that you feel like you're doing something. You can feel like it has a lot of weight to it. I'll show up some gameplay footage in between while I'm talking here, because this is mostly a talking subject, so it doesn't really fit this sort of thing. But I'll show up some footage of Black Desert, for example, and I'll do another video talking about the camera shake and stuff like that when we actually get into it. But when you actually hit an enemy, for example, let's say you push a button, you can immediately feel that interaction. So let's say I go in and I'm playing on my Archer, for example, preset and what I'm going to end up recording later. I will just end up being like, okay, I want to use this ability. Immediately, the character jumps back, hits the arrow, and the screen shakes. The controller vibrates, and everything feels like I'm in the moment. And that is what I'm talking about game weight. When I end up firing off those arrows and I'm hitting those enemies, the camera shakes, the enemies react, everything around it just feels like it has an impact. And that's what game weight really is. Now, if you end up looking at other examples, like games that don't really have a lot of weight, I don't know what I'm going to record for that because I don't really play games that don't have a lot of weight, but you end up going into it and it's like, oh, you end up hitting an enemy and it doesn't really feel like it has any weight. It's Skyrim. There we go. I'll just do Skyrim. When you end up playing Skyrim, you'll end up hitting an enemy with a sword or something along those lines, and it doesn't really feel like it has a lot of impact because the enemies don't really react. But let's say the shield bash, for example, especially when you end up getting into mods and stuff like that, I'll just show up like unmodded footage because I don't want to go through my entire mod install. But you end up hitting somebody with a shield and you're like, oh wow, that felt powerful because it knocks them back. And that is what real weight is. And non-weighty combat can feel very light and fluid, but it doesn't really feel like it has a good impact. And this also carries over to 2D games, for example. I'll show up Downwell. Downwell is a great example to where when you end up jumping off of an enemy or you end up firing off the little gun boots, it feels incredible. So for example, I'll go back to my little drawing board here. Man, I'm gonna have to record so much footage for this, I'm just realizing. Anyways, you have your little dude here and he's like, and then he's shooting gun bullets downwards, and every single time it does it, there's a little bit of screen shake and there's a color. So you'll end up hitting these, there's an enemy here or whatever, and when you hit it, it bursts off a color, right? And so when you're firing, it also has a little bit of color. And this is what game weight really is. It is the feeling and impact of the game. And this is incredibly important. And why is that? Because it makes it feel like you're actually progressing with the button. Let's say you're just going through, oops, I pushed the wrong button. Let's say you're just going into like a game or something along those lines, and let's say there's a menu selection, for example, and this is getting into the menus, but you end up having your menu selections here. Now, if you push a button and then, this one just lights up or whatever, and so it's like, yay, or whatever, and then you unselect that one so it goes away, and then this one lights up, and you're like, yay. That doesn't really have a lot of weight to it. But let's say you end up animating this, and I'll do this in post. Let's say you've got your circles for your selection here or whatever, and so it's got, main menu or whatever. main, sub, I guess. I don't know what I'm going to do. And then basically you end up selecting between them. So you're on main, but then you jump downwards, and I'll animate this a little bit later, but then you jump downwards and it's like, boom. And then instantly it like pops up and moves over. That is UI weight. And that is weight that makes it so that you feel like it has a little bit of weight. Because let's say in real life, when you end up toggling through something, like let's say your phone or something along those lines, when you end up toggling through something, it has a little bit of kickback, right? When you go through like flipping a light switch, for example, you have this light switch and you flip it up, right? It has a little bit of weight to it. It feels like you have resistance. And this is the goal of game weight. And why this is so important is because it gives a lot of player feedback. Going back into our kind of primary points here, weight is in all of these sorts of sections. And while I'm kind of excluding story for the moment, when it comes down to combat, movement, and UI, there's a huge dissonance between actually playing something and then actually feeling it, because we're looking at a screen and we're holding a non-moving device, except for the rumble feature in controllers, but we'll talk about that in a second. But you have to make sure that your player feels like they are in that world, and you have to feel like you're moving. For example, let's say you're in a first-person game or whatever, you don't have full range of vision like you normally would in real life. And therefore, when you end up moving, you need to make sure that it feels like you're moving inside that world. Otherwise, you just feel like a floating camera. And a floating camera is much harder to get attached to. And this actually goes into the story aspects as well, to where once you end up having that immersion, it's called, you have that immersion that you feel like you're in that experience, then you can start to tell a story. And whether that story is actually scripted, let's say it's a JRPG or something along those lines, unless that story is actually going through and like it's just text or whatever, even then it can have weight because, you know, obviously emotions and things like that can be weight as well. But it's about getting the player invested. It's about making them feel invested. And so when they actually go in and they're immersed, they actually feel like they're part of that story. And the story doesn't have to be scripted. It could be something like Downwell, for example. The story isn't so much, oh, he's going down a well to find demons at the very bottom of the well. I'll try and capture that much footage, but I probably won't. But you end up going into it and you're like, all right, this story is all about me going down this well. It's not necessarily the dude inside the image, but it's you, because you feel that weight and you feel it. You feel like you have resistances, you feel like you have challenge, and you feel like you have danger. And that is generally what weight is. And when it gets into the danger section, that's when story becomes really, really important. Because in order to tell a good story inside of a game, you also need to have a lot of weight, because you need your players to actually feel what the in-game characters would feel or what you would want the character to feel in general. And if you don't have weight, then you don't really have any of that. Also, it makes it a lot easier to control. For example, let's say you end up playing a game that feels very, very floaty. And so you can end up hitting, just find a smooth board, you end up moving left or whatever, and then you end up moving over. But if you don't have any sort of player feedback, if you don't actually feel like you move left, then all of a sudden you're over here and you have no idea how you got there. And then it causes confusion, which makes it so that your mechanics are a lot less easy to understand. But let's say you end up making it so it shakes or something whenever you move or whatever, or maybe it makes it so that it's very responsive to your camera movements. Let's say on the right stick of your gamepad or whatever, you end up hitting left and you hit it over and then you're immediately over here and it actually feels fluid. And then when you let go, it automatically is there. This is another reason why responsiveness is really important, because responsiveness can go into a lot of weight. Let's say, for example, you didn't want them to feel all that responsive. Let's say you didn't want them to feel weight. Let's say this is a fun trope in games. Let's say you wanted to make your character drunk or whatever. So he's been having a few too many beers and you wanted to make it take a little bit longer and feel a little unresponsive. This can also be used to make weight. For example, you end up having the circle. The player will push to the left. However, it'll take several seconds until the circle is like, oh, wait a second, I should start moving left. And then you can actually make that so that it feels like, oh, whoa, like this is a huge dissonance from what I'm used to. Let's say, for example, in a first-person shooter, you know, there's plenty of games that have drunkenness, but I'm going to use something like, let's say Far Cry 2 had malaria. Whenever you ended up starting feeling malaria, the camera would kind of stutter a little bit and have a little bit of trouble moving around because your character's having trouble seeing, he's feeling really woozy, and it actually felt really impactful because most of the time, it was 100% fine. You end up looking around perfectly fine. And then all of a sudden, when this starts taking over your body, you're like, whoa, because all of a sudden your camera is unresponsive, your camera is blurry, all of a sudden things are shaking, and it's really, really difficult to actually play the game when that goes on. So you have to end up taking the malaria drugs and stuff like that inside that game. It's mechanics and yada, yada. I won't get too much into it. But that actually added a lot of weight, and that goes into also adding into the story. And the reason why that's so important is because if all of a sudden it's like a meter pops up and it's like, you've got malaria, you have, oh, I can't spell today. Millie, I'm just gonna call it Millie. I don't know. That maybe it's like some random disease made by millennials. So basically, you have Millie, and then so if it just popped up a little notification, you're just going to be like, oh, okay, cool. And then I just push a button and then, push X or whatever. And then it's like, Millie gone. What kind of impact is that going to have? God damn it. Why am I even trying to write today? And so Millie is gone. And it's like, but that didn't really feel like anything. You didn't feel like you had Millie. You didn't feel like it's gone now either. It just feels exactly the same. And this is why game weight is so incredibly important. And that basically sums up what all the kind of gameplay style stuff is and why it's kind of important is because it makes it so that your player feels like it's in your world and it makes it much more fun to play because it just feels so much better. And it's really hard to explain until you actually look at some examples. I'll try to find some examples and I'll throw up footage of weighted gameplay. I don't play a lot of games that don't have a lot of weight in them because I don't feel like they're that impressive. But games that have a lot of weight, such as Senran Kagura, for example, has a lot of weight when you end up using like a heavier style character, and that game's a little bit suggestive, but whatever, I'll end up throwing up footage of it anyways. It's got a lot of weight to its gameplay, and that makes it feel like every single character is unique as well, so you can end up having it so that major differences between characters goes into a weight. Now, I do want to make a separate section here. So if you're just here for gameplay, that's kind of why it's important. Now, how do you implement this? I'll talk about in another video. I'll talk about that more in depth in other types of cases, such as camera shake, for example. I'll be doing topics specifically on those types of stuff. So if you're looking forward to like camera shake and stuff like that, I'll be covering camera shake next. I'm actually recording that video because it's already scripted later today. But specifically, I want to talk about UI design for a little bit, because this is one that is massively misunderstood when it comes down to games. And as somebody who went through graphic design in school and everything that actually goes into UX design and et cetera, I kind of look at a lot of game UIs and kind of laugh a little bit. And I'm not saying I'm perfect at UI design, but let's go ahead and talk about weight inside of a UI, because this is going to be a very short topic, so I'm almost done. But let's say you have your health bar over here, for example, and it's just like, it's filled up or whatever. It's like, boom, I've got health or whatever. Let's go ahead and say that you end up taking damage, for example. And let's say you add in all the other things that add weight. So your character gets knocked back and there's blood splurting everywhere. And, your character's like, oh, no. And then I don't know. So basically he's like doing the splits and he got hit by something and it does all the other things like camera shake. It has blurring, et cetera. And you're like, all right, cool. That feels weighted. But then what happens to your UI? It's like, oh, well, it just makes it so that this whites out a little bit, right? And so it's like, okay, well, cool. There's other things you can do inside of this, and there's a lot of little small key things that a lot of AAA games ended up doing, and a lot of really good indie games ended up doing as well. So let's say this ended up knocking them down a little bit. One thing that games could do, and you see this in a lot of Japanese games, is they'll make a small block fall off of it, for example. Then all of a sudden, you are given a visual indicator, and that is a weight. You are watching something fall off of your health bar, and you are immediately noticing that. Or, for example, they'll make it shake when you end up going in through it. And so, for example, Bayonetta, whenever you take damage, if it's like, boom, you've taken a bunch of damage or whatever, it will shake the UI around as well. Not just the camera, but the UI as well. And so it's like, oh, wow, now everything is impacted because the UI is your front-facing thing. It is a user interface, and it is the first thing that you're going to look at when you end up looking at like a rendering a scene and et cetera, et cetera. And so if they're not shaking, but the rest of the scene is, it can cause a little bit of dissonance between that. And so having it shake as well can actually add in a lot of depth. You can also add it in, let's say, spatial distortion or something along those lines. You end up seeing a lot of space games kind of use it. You can also use the UI to cause a lot of weight when movement. So I'll try and find an example. I'm sure there's tons of them, and I'm not going to find one before I end up having to do this video. But you can end up making it so that when you move your camera, the UI moves as well. And so maybe when you end up moving left, the UI moves slightly over. And then when you move to the right, it moves slightly over. And you can end up doing that to add a lot of weight as well. Because let's say you're playing Halo, for example. Halo, I know Halo had it in Halo Reach. I haven't played any of the other Halos since then. But in Halo Reach, they actually made it so that you could, when you moved, it had a slight sway to the UI. Metroid Prime has this, although that's Nintendo, so I can't actually show footage of it because they will take my video. And then, so it actually makes it so that you feel like you're wearing a visor, or maybe that it is a separate element on a UI. Another thing you can end up doing is changing the color. And so let's say this character ends up getting really low on health. All of a sudden, this entire health bar turns red, and you're like, whoa, okay, maybe I'm actually damaged, and that can also be used as weight. And again, this is really important for the same exact reason that gameplay weight is, and the fact that this makes it so that you can end up seeing it immediately in front of your face, and you're like, whoa, and you actually feel that impact. And although a UI is technically not something that is going to be immersive most of the time, like let's say, a visor, you can end up making that immersive. but it adds in extra flair feedback and it makes it so that you feel a little bit more of that damage per se when you end up getting knocked out and doing the splits. And so, yeah, if you're actually looking at designing a game or you're looking at game critique and you hear weight, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about the actual feeling. Do we feel like we're in that game? Do we feel like we're being punched? Do we feel like we're punching? Do we feel like we're jumping? Do you feel like I'm flying? Do we feel like whatever? That is what we talk about inside of game weight. And it is incredibly important. And it's really important for designers to look at it in all of these sort of elements and many, many more. There is much more to weight than I have covered in this video, but of course that's for other types of stuff. I'll be talking about more of these in specific cases, so if you have any suggestions, make sure to leave them in the comments. But otherwise, thank you guys so much for watching. Make sure to like and subscribe for more content like this one. I tried to be a little bit shorter in this one. The other ones that I did in this style were a little bit longer form. So this one I'm actually splitting up into a bunch of different videos, and so hopefully that's a little bit better off. I kind of want to make this a weekly series, and so I'm kind of trying to find ways to trim it down and make them a little bit easier. It takes a lot of research to do these though, but anyways, we'll end up doing that. So go ahead and leave a comment what you end up thinking about the series and the way it's going. And of course, leave other topics that you would like to end up seeing as well. And of course, if you end up liking my styles of content, you can check out my website at michaelpstanich.com. As of yesterday, it's having some problems with this web host, so it might not be working 100% today, but I am working to get that fixed. Currently, I'm hosting my website on GitHub now because I lost my web host. And they have to refund me a bunch of money, which is a little bit frustrating. Yeah, anyways, I won't rage on for too long. And then, of course, if you like gaming, you can end up checking out the Broken Chat Box, which is our open gaming Discord. We end up doing a bunch of chats, and we play video games all the time. So you can end up jumping in there, and maybe you want to talk about game design, or maybe you have some examples, or maybe you just don't want to leave comments on YouTube. You can just leave them in the Broken Chat Box as well. We have places for that. Anyways, thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. And now I have to go record like 50 different games. God dang it.